A woman 6 months pregnant knelt down into a puddle of cold water in the middle of the market, spreading her arms to shield an old lady in a wheelchair she had never met in her life. She didn't know that the last few crumpled bills in her pocket were about to change her fate forever. And she certainly didn't know that poor old woman in the faded sweater was the mother of the most powerful and feared man in all of Chicago. That morning, the red brick weekend market woke up the way it always did. The first cold wind of the season drifted through the wooden stalls, carrying the scent of ripe apples and fresh-baked bread, the kind of smell that takes people back to old kitchens and to a mother's hands long gone. At the corner of the market, close to the walkway, an old lady sat quietly in a worn-out wheelchair. Her knitted gloves were torn at the fingers. In front of her, a bucket of white daisies waited for a buyer. People walked by, people walked past. Hardly anyone stopped. No one in that market knew who she was. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Then a car horn ripped the morning apart. A gleaming white SUV pushed its way into the pedestrian lane, its horn blasting in bursts like the crack of a whip. The wheels of the old wheelchair slipped off the edge of the curb. The frail old body tipped over. The bucket flew. White daisies scattered into the rainwater left from the night before, their petals crushed into the mud. The car door opened. A young woman stepped out, white fur coat, dark sunglasses, her heels striking the stone in dry, sharp beats. Bianca Sterling, heiress to a hotel empire, hadn't come to this market to buy flowers. She had come to look over the land her family was about to flatten. To her, everything here, the wooden stalls, the struggling lives, and even the old woman lying in the cold water, was simply something to be cleared away. She did not bend down to help. She bent down to look. "Old woman, are you blind? Trash like you belongs in a nursing home, not crawling out here, dirtying other people's cars." The old lady pressed a trembling hand against the stone ground. Her legs had stopped obeying her a long, long time ago. All around, phones rose up to record. But not a single hand reached out. The crowd stayed silent. And that kind of silence, sometimes, is colder than the puddle beneath an old woman's back. And then, someone stepped forward. Not some strong man, not a police officer. A young woman in a wool coat frayed at the cuffs, her brown hair tied low, carrying a 6-month baby bump. Sadie Brooks, a widow who never got to wear her wedding dress, a single mother with a folded electricity shut-off notice in her coat pocket, pushed through the crowd, walked straight over, and did the one thing that made the entire corner of the market hold its breath. She knelt down into the cold puddle, right between the two women, turning her own body into a shield. The cold water soaked through her knees. One hand steadied the old lady's back. The other rested gently on her own belly, like a silent promise to her unborn child. "I will teach you by the way I live. Who are you?" The woman in the white fur hissed. "The beggar's lawyer?" Sadie lifted her head. Her voice wasn't loud, but every soul in that market heard every word. "No, I'm just someone who still remembers she was brought into this world by a mother." That morning, Sadie Brooks believed she had simply helped a stranger up from a puddle. She had no idea that across the row of stalls, a quiet camera had captured everything. She had no idea that those aging eyes had been searching this city for a heart like hers for weeks on end, and she could never have known that single act of kneeling down was about to pull her into the world of a man whose name all of Chicago spoke only in whispers. A world of black iron gates, of blood debts left unpaid, and of a truth about the death of her baby's father, a truth she herself had never once dared to imagine. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel because stories of kindness deserve to be told again. That same morning, on the other side of the city, the South Harbor lay submerged beneath a gray veil of fog that hadn't yet fully lifted. Warehouse number 7 stood silent among rows of towering shipping containers, and inside, the air was so heavy that every drop of water falling from the rusted metal roof could be heard with perfect clarity. A thin man sat on an iron chair in the middle of the warehouse, his hands clasped together, sweat soaking the back of his shirt despite the cold. His name was Judd, the accountant for one of the nightclubs belonging to the Vale family, and he'd just been caught passing internal ledgers to Cormac Doyle's gang on the north side. Before him stood a man as still as a shadow carved from stone, a black suit with no tie, his late father's old watch resting on his left wrist. Grayson Vale didn't shout. He didn't pound his fist against the table, and it was precisely that silence that kept the more than a dozen members of the organization standing along the warehouse walls from daring to breathe too loudly. Everyone at the harbor knew one thing. When the young head of the Vale family still raised his voice, there was still some hope of salvation. But when he lowered it, someone was about to disappear from the city. "Mr. Vale, I'm begging you," Judd stammered, trembling so badly that the words tangled on his tongue. "Doyle forced me. He found out about my debt. He threatened to go after my wife and children. I swear to you, I never wanted to betray the Vale family." Grayson raised one finger. Judd fell silent as though his voice had been pulled from his throat. Grayson approached him slowly, then placed a brown envelope on his lap. Judd opened it with trembling fingers, and what he found inside wasn't what he'd feared. It was a bus ticket. One way, out of Chicago that very day. "Your father once took a bullet for mine at the old docks," Grayson said, his voice low and even, no louder than the water dripping from the roof. "Because of him, you get to leave this city on your own 2 feet. It's the last bus of the day. Don't miss it." Judd looked up, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You're letting me go? I'm repaying the debt I owed your father, and that debt has just been settled." Grayson leaned closer, and for the first time that morning, his gray eyes grew a shade colder. "The next man won't get a ticket. Give Doyle a message for me. If he wants the Vale family's ledgers, he can come and take them himself, if he still has the nerve to cross the river." 2 men escorted Judd toward the door, his feet barely seeming to touch the floor. The warehouse door had only just closed when Merrick entered through a side passage, the middle-aged bodyguard who'd served the Vale family since Grayson's father was still alive. He said nothing. He simply held a phone out to his employer. Its screen paused on footage recorded at Red Brick Market. Grayson took it and watched the video from beginning to end, and those standing nearest to him saw his jaw tighten little by little, with every passing second. When the footage ended, he looked up, his voice as sharp as the blade of a box cutter. "You were there. You stood there filming while my mother lay in a pool of cold water." "Sir, I was 20 meters away from her, exactly the distance your mother ordered me to keep." Merrick stood straight and didn't avoid his employer's gaze. "She gave me secret orders several weeks ago. I was to follow her from a distance every time she went to the market. I wasn't to reveal myself. I wasn't to intervene unless her life was in danger, and under no circumstances was I to tell you. She said that if I breathed so much as half a word, she would personally throw me out of the Vale household. I'm sorry, sir, but in this family, her orders stand above mine, and even above yours." Grayson stared at the aging bodyguard for a long moment, the anger in his chest mingling with a strange sense of helplessness. The man who could make the entire harbor bow its head, it seemed, still ranked below an old woman in a wheelchair inside his own home. "Take me home," he said, then strode toward the black car waiting outside the warehouse. The armored vehicle swept through the tall iron gates at the northern edge of the city just as the midday sun began touching the bare trees. Grayson pushed open the front door, and the first thing he saw was his mother sitting in her wheelchair in the middle of the grand foyer, her silver hair still damp, her faded sweater carrying the musty scent of the market, the fingerless, torn gloves still on her hands. "Mother." He crossed the foyer in only a few strides. "You're soaked. How many times have I told you that if you want to go somewhere, all you have to do is tell me? I'll have an entire convoy escort you. Why do you insist on putting yourself through this? Tell me why." "Grayson, bring me a basin of warm water first." Rosalind Vale looked up at her son, her aged face strangely calm, as though the woman who'd fallen into a puddle at the market that morning had been someone else entirely. "You can shout at me later. My hands are freezing." And the man who'd nearly made an accountant faint inside a warehouse silently went to fetch warm water, knelt on one knee beside the wheelchair, removed the torn gloves one at a time, and gently dried each of his mother's frozen fingers with a white cotton towel. All of Chicago might tremble at the name Grayson Vale, but in that foyer, beneath the gaze of the silver-haired woman before him, he was only a son who was angry with his mother, but couldn't bear to be harsh with her. "Now tell me," he said softly, his eyes still fixed on her wrinkled hands. "Who made you fall? I only need one name, Mother." Rosa looked down at the crown of her son's head as he knelt at her feet, and a light that was difficult to name flickered through her aged eyes, half weary, half amused by a chess game only she could see. "One name," Rosa repeated her son's words, as she slowly removed the damp shawl from her shoulders. "And then what, son? You'll send your men to her home, force her to her knees, and make her apologize. Make certain that no one in her family can hold their head up anywhere in this city again. Isn't that right?" That's the very least I should do for you. No, that's the easiest thing you could do. She rested her newly warmed hand on the hair of the son, kneeling at her feet. But you've been running from the hardest thing for years. Sit down, Grayson. Today, I want to speak to my son, not to the head of the Vale family. He pulled the leather-upholstered chair closer and sat across from her wheelchair, and in the midday light pouring through the tall windows, anyone could have seen how strangely alike their faces were. The same firm jaw, the same eyes that had learned how to keep silent. Go on, Mother. Tell me, why do you insist on wearing torn clothes, sitting in that ancient wheelchair, and going to the market to sell flowers as though you had no home and nothing to your name? What could you possibly lack? If you want flowers, I'll buy you an entire field beside the lake. I don't go there to sell flowers. I go there to find someone. Find whom? A daughter-in-law. A dry laugh escaped Grayson. Mother. Go ahead and laugh. Rosa didn't smile. I'm old. These legs haven't worked since the night your father died. And you know that. The same burst of gunfire took him from this world and left me behind on these four wheels. I'm not afraid to follow him, Grayson. There's only one thing I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that when I close my eyes for the last time, my son will still be sitting alone in this mansion filled with bodyguards, eating alone, signing papers alone, unable to trust a single living, breathing human being in this world. I have good reason not to trust anyone. You know that better than anybody. Yes, I do. Her voice didn't retreat from the truth, nor did it soften. I was the one who sat in that prison visiting room through all the months you were wrongfully imprisoned. I remember every pane of glass that stood between you and me. I know who framed you, and I also know that the prison bars weren't what broke you. It was that girl, the girl you intended to entrust with the entire Vale name. She sold your schedule to the very man who'd set you up, and before a single winter had passed, she was wearing his ring and smiling beside him in the newspapers. From the day you walked out of that place, I watched you lock every door inside your heart, one after another. You treat love as a breach in security. You examine people as though you were searching for buried mines. Grayson, do you think I haven't noticed? I'm your mother. I see everything. The foyer became so quiet that the ticking of the old watch on his wrist could be heard. Grayson looked down at his hands for a long time before he finally spoke, and when he did, his voice was no longer the voice that issued commands inside the warehouse. The person who betrayed me was one person. Don't ask me to open the door to the whole world. I'm not asking you to open the door to the whole world. I simply don't want you to punish the whole world for one person's crime, because in the end, the one serving a life sentence for that crime is you. He rose, walked toward the window, and looked out at the bare trees casting long shadows across the lawn. After a long while, he spoke without turning around. You don't need to go to the market looking for anyone anymore. I'm seeing someone. The wheels of the chair made a faint sound against the stone floor as Rosa turned toward her son. Since when? For a while now. Bianca Sterling. The Sterling family, the hotel chain. Her world fits with mine. She knows the rules of the game. She doesn't pretend to be innocent, and she doesn't put on a show of weakness to take things from people. For me, that makes her safe enough. Safe. Rosa repeated the word as though she were lifting a stone to examine what lay beneath it. Are you choosing a wife or a safe, son? Very well. Then I'll ask you only one question, and I want an honest answer. How does that Sterling girl treat people who can do nothing for her? A waiter who brings her the wrong dish. A driver who arrives late. A poor old woman blocking her path. Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it again. Memories passed through his mind. The parties, the times Bianca had snapped her fingers to summon a server, the narrowing of her eyes when an attendant dropped her invitation, and he suddenly realized that he'd never once seen that woman thank anyone she considered beneath her. The silence stretched between them, and it gave Rosa his answer. I see, she said with a slow nod. There was no mockery in her voice, only a weariness that seemed very old. Grayson, listen to me. Confidence without compassion is a gold-covered knife. It may look elegant, but if you hold it long enough, it will cut your hand. You haven't even met her. Then let me meet her. Rosa lifted her head, and that nameless glimmer appeared once more in the depths of her eyes. This weekend. One dinner, here in this house. Bring that Sterling girl home and have dinner with me, so I can look at her with my own eyes, not through the newspapers and not through the things you tell me. If I'm wrong about her, I'll prepare the wedding for the two of you with my own hands. But if I'm right. She left the sentence unfinished and turned her wheelchair toward the hallway, leaving her son standing alone in the stream of sunlight, with the vague premonition that the dinner awaiting him that weekend would be unlike any dinner he'd ever attended. And he was right, in a way even he could never have imagined. Late on the weekend afternoon, the familiar white SUV came to a stop before the black iron gates of the Vale mansion, and the woman who stepped out wore an ivory evening gown and carried a box of wine that cost as much as half a year's wages for an ordinary worker. Bianca Sterling looked up at the towering gray stone residence before her, and in those perfectly lined eyes gleamed the light of a woman arriving to take inventory of her future property. "Darling," she said, brushing an airy kiss against Grayson's cheek on the front steps, "I finally get to walk through these gates. You know, none of my friends can believe we've been together for 2 whole years, and today is the first time I'm meeting your mother. She certainly keeps to herself. Not a single photograph in the newspapers. Not one appearance at any party in our social circle. I was beginning to think you were hiding a castle from me with a dragon guarding the door. My mother doesn't like strangers. You're the first person I've ever brought to this house. Then I'll have to make a perfect impression." She adjusted the hem of her gown, stepped across the threshold, and made a remark as her gaze swept over the grand foyer. "The house is lovely, but you really should replace that ancient furniture. It looks poor, and it doesn't suit the Vale family's status at all. That furniture belonged to my father. That's exactly why I said it was old." She laughed brightly, never noticing that the temperature in the voice of the man beside her had just fallen several degrees. They entered the living room, warm beneath the glow of golden lights, and at the center of the room, seated upright in a wheelchair upholstered in gleaming black leather, was an elderly woman with silver hair and an ash-gray shawl around her shoulders. She was slowly arranging the last of the crushed white chrysanthemums in a crystal vase on the coffee table, beside a pair of woolen gloves with torn fingers that had been folded neatly like precious objects on display. "Bianca," Grayson said, "this is my mother, Rosalind Vale." Bianca put on the smile she'd practiced before the mirror at home, stepped forward twice, and opened her mouth to offer the proper greeting. Then her entire face froze halfway through, as though someone had suddenly unplugged her. The box of wine nearly slipped from her hands and crashed onto the stone floor. That aged face, those torn woolen gloves, and those crushed white chrysanthemums, the same flowers she'd once seen lying flattened in muddy water. "No," she whispered, the blood draining from her face so quickly that the blush on her cheeks suddenly looked grotesquely out of place. "That's impossible." "What's wrong, young lady?" Rosa looked up, her voice as calm as though she were asking about the weather. "You look as if you've just run into an old acquaintance." "You, ma'am," Bianca stammered, retreating half a step. Then the survival instinct of someone accustomed to maneuvering through crowded ballrooms sprang to life, and she changed her tone as quickly as turning the page of a magazine. "This has to be a misunderstanding. I was under so much pressure at the market that day. My assistant had ruined my entire appointment. Traffic was completely jammed, and then someone suddenly fell right in front of my car. Anyone in my position would have been upset. Besides, dressed the way you were that day, how was anyone supposed to know? How was anyone supposed to know she was the mother of the man you wanted to marry?" Grayson said. His voice wasn't loud, but the entire room seemed to turn cold. "Darling, just listen to me." Bianca spun toward him, her voice instantly becoming sweet as honey. "I was wrong, all right. I'm sorry. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. And I truly mean that. Whatever flower shop you like, I'll buy the entire place for you. I'll even order you the finest wheelchair from Switzerland, and it'll be here next week. Let me make amends to my future mother-in-law. Would that be enough?" Rosa didn't answer. She merely looked at her son. Grayson took his phone from his suit pocket, placed it on the coffee table, and pressed play. From the small device, the sounds of that morning rang out with perfect clarity through the deathly silent room. Car horns blared in impatient bursts. Something shattered, and then a woman's cutting voice sliced through the air. "Trash like you should stay in a nursing home, instead of crawling out here and making other people's cars filthy." Bianca stood rooted to the spot, her lips trembling with every sentence of her own voice that echoed back at her. And when the recording played the words of a young woman saying, "I'm only someone who still remembers that I was born from a mother," her eyes darkened with something that wasn't shame, but hatred. Grayson let the footage play until the final second, before picking up the phone and slipping it into the inner pocket of his jacket, moving with the same unhurried calm of a man who'd just finished reviewing a financial report. "Grayson, please listen to me." Bianca said, clasping her hands together as tears rose with flawless timing. After 2 years together, are you really going to throw us away because I lost my temper for 1 minute? Losing your temper for 1 minute means raising your voice and regretting it afterward. You stood there watching a woman who couldn't use her legs lying in cold water, and the only thing you felt sorry for was the paint on your car. That wasn't anger, Bianca. That was the original version of you. You simply let me see it sooner than you intended. He turned and took his place beside his mother's wheelchair. Merrick, show our guest out. The living room door opened at that exact moment, and the older bodyguard stood waiting there, one hand extended politely toward the exit. Bianca looked at the 3 people before her, her chest rising and falling, and the last of her masks slipped away and shattered against the stone floor. Very well, Grayson Vale. No one is allowed to leave me. Do you hear me? No one. Her voice hissed through clenched teeth as she backed toward the doorway. And as for that pregnant woman who played the saint in the middle of the market that day, she can wait. I'll find out who she is. Then both of you will learn that a sterling isn't someone people can trample beneath their feet and walk away from. The sound of her heels faded into the distance. The front door slammed shut. An engine roared to life, then disappeared beyond the iron gates, leaving behind the silence of the room and the faint fragrance of chrysanthemums. Grayson stood by the window for a long time, watching darkness slowly spread across the lawn, until he heard the soft squeak of wheelchair wheels approaching the desk in the corner of the room. Rosa lifted the most badly crushed chrysanthemum from the crystal vase, its petals still marked by traces of mud that hadn't washed away completely, and laid it carefully on the wooden desktop, before the framed photograph of Grayson's late father. "What are you doing, Mother?" "You saw the girl in that footage," she said, without answering his question. She knelt in that puddle while she still had a notice in her pocket saying her electricity was about to be shut off, and she bought these ruined flowers with the last money she had. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't need to know who I was. "Grayson, you're accustomed to people coming to you because of the Vale name, aren't you? Then this time, I want you to find the woman who knelt down when there was nothing she could possibly gain in return." Grayson looked at the crushed flower on the desk, then at his mother. "You don't even know who she is. Her name is Sadie Brooks." Rosa turned her wheelchair toward the door and left him with a final remark, as light and deliberate as setting a chess piece upon the board. "If the son of the Vale family can't find one young woman in the heart of Chicago, then even I won't know what to do with you." 3 days later, a man in an ordinary gray wool coat appeared at Red Brick Market, without bodyguards, without a convoy, with only Merrick waiting in an old car parked 2 blocks away, wearing the expression of a man whose every attempt to stop him had failed. Grayson Vale possessed an advantage few crime bosses in the country could claim. The entire city knew his name, knew his black armored car, knew the iron gates on the northern edge of Chicago, yet almost no one knew his face, because his father had once taught him that any man who put his face in the newspapers was painting a target on his own forehead, and Grayson had held fast to that principle as faithfully as he wore the watch on his left wrist. He hadn't come because he believed his mother. The woman behind those iron gates had never been wrong about a person. But he was a man who'd once paid far too high a price for misjudging someone himself, so he trusted nothing he hadn't personally verified, even when it came from his own mother. He found Sadie without difficulty. In a secluded corner behind a vegetable stall, a young pregnant woman sat mending a split seam on a child's coat for the stall owner, in exchange for a bag of vegetables left over at the end of the day. Her brown hair was tied low, just as it had been in the footage. Her sweater was frayed at the cuffs, just as it had been in the footage. The only difference was that in person, she was thinner than he'd imagined. He stood at a distance and watched her, and then he saw something that hadn't been part of any calculation. An elderly homeless man pulling a cart piled high with empty cans stopped nearby, his eyes fixed on the sandwich Sadie had just unwrapped and was about to eat, her first full meal of the day. She looked at the old man, looked at the sandwich, then without saying a word, broke it in half, gave him the larger portion, kept the smaller one for herself, and even poured him a cup of warm water from her dented thermos. There were no cameras recording her. No one applauded. She didn't even look around to see if anyone had noticed. Grayson stood on the other side of the row of stalls, and something very old stirred softly inside his chest. He approached after the old man had disappeared, pretending to examine several cartons of strawberries at the neighboring stall, before making a casual remark. "Half a sandwich for a long day. Are you sure that's enough?" Sadie looked up and swept her eyes over the stranger from head to toe exactly once, before stopping at his shoes. "It's better than having a whole one that doesn't taste good, mister. Are you lost? You don't look like someone who shops at this market." "How do you know I don't shop here?" "Because people who shop here look at the tomatoes first and the price second." "You've been looking at me this whole time." She spoke matter-of-factly, her hand never leaving the needle, and Grayson, the man who could make the most hardened arms dealers measure every word before speaking to him, suddenly found himself thrown off balance for exactly 1 second. "I'm sorry. I saw what you did for that old man." "Oh," she shrugged. "It was only half a sandwich. It's true that I'm eating for 2, but that old man was alone and had nothing. People don't often do things like that, especially when they're struggling themselves." "Then people are foolish," she replied simply, and for the first time, she smiled, and he realized that her smile brightened the entire dreary corner of the market in a way that made no sense at all. They talked, first about the price of vegetables in the cold season, then somehow about the business degree she'd once studied for, the little bakery she'd once dreamed of owning with an old oven inside, and the way he answered the question about his occupation with the 2 words, "I'm in business," which made her laugh and tell him that everyone in Chicago was in business, and what mattered was what kind of business he did, though he somehow managed to give her an unnecessarily long answer to that. She let him off the hook because he looked capable of carrying a sack of potatoes for the stall owner without complaining. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, he asked for her phone number, and Sadie looked at him with an expression that was half amused and half serious. "No. Why not?" "Because a man wearing $1,000 shoes shouldn't ask for the number of an unemployed pregnant woman." She shifted the bag of vegetables higher on her shoulder and gave him a perfectly polite nod. "Thank you for carrying the potatoes. Goodbye, Mr. Business." She disappeared behind the row of stalls, walking with a slight tilt because of the weight of her belly, and Grayson Vale stood in the windswept evening market watching her go. Then he did something that made even Merrick, sitting in the car 2 blocks away, rub his eyes when he caught sight of him in the rearview mirror. The crime boss of the South Harbor was standing there laughing to himself, a real laugh rising freely from his chest, a sound no one had heard from that man in a very long time, not since before the night his father fell, and Grayson's entire world locked itself behind black iron gates. From that day on, the man she called Mr. Business began appearing at Red Brick Market every few days with excuses so awkward that Sadie couldn't help laughing. Sometimes he claimed he'd been passing by and thought he might buy some apples. Sometimes he said his company had business nearby. Once, he told her the strawberries from the previous week had been so delicious while pointing directly at a stall full of onions. Yet every visit ended the same way, with him carrying boxes and sacks for one vendor after another like an unpaid laborer. Sadie didn't give him her phone number, but she didn't send him away either, because there was something very unusual about this man. He didn't look at her pregnant belly with the pity she'd grown accustomed to seeing in other people's eyes. He didn't ask intrusive questions about where the baby's father was. He simply spoke to her as though she were his equal, and in a city that had taught her to lower her head and hurry past every stare, that was worth more than any amount of money. One afternoon, as they sat together on the stone steps behind the vegetable stall waiting for a light rain to pass, she told him about her dream. It wasn't anything grand, just a little bakery with an old oven and the scent of fresh bread drifting all the way into the street every morning, because the smell of baking bread was the only thing she still carried with her from the mother who'd left when she was too young to remember her face. Sadie couldn't remember her mother's voice or the feeling of her arms. She remembered only one distant morning when someone had held her in a warm kitchen filled with the fragrance of bread, and she'd spent her entire life searching for that morning again. Grayson listened in silence without interrupting her once. Then he asked very softly, "What about the baby's father?" Sadie stared out at the rain for a long while, turning the slender silver ring on her middle finger before she began to speak, her voice calm and slow, like someone reading aloud from an old letter she'd long since memorized. His name was Caleb. He'd worked as a scaffolder, and had been so gentle that even the stray cat in their neighborhood used to bully him. They'd planned to marry in the spring, and she'd even paid the deposit on a white dress that still hung inside a little shop down the street. Then one afternoon, her phone rang. Someone told her there had been an accident at the construction site, and she rushed there only to discover that she'd become a widow before she'd ever had the chance to become a bride. His company held several meetings behind closed doors, handed her a stack of papers claiming the dead man had been at fault, then slammed every door to compensation in the face of a woman who'd only recently discovered she was pregnant. "Did you sue them?" Grayson asked, hearing the sudden roughness in his own voice. "With what?" she replied. Their lawyers were as numerous as an army, while I had to count every coin just to make copies of the forms. There was only one thing I managed to keep. She took an old phone with a cracked screen from her coat pocket, opened her voice messages, and showed him a single starred recording, the message Caleb had sent her on his final morning. He left me a recording while I was still asleep. I listened to the first half. He laughed and reminded me to eat breakfast. But I've never dared to play the rest. I'm afraid that once I hear all of it, there truly won't be anything left to wait for. Do you understand? As long as I haven't finished listening, there's still something he hasn't said to me yet. At some point, the rain had stopped. Water dripped steadily from the edge of the canvas, awning onto the stone pavement, and Grayson Vale sat motionless on the steps, unable for the first time in his life to decide where to place his hands. He'd used the power of the Vale name to do many things, to punish, to warn, to force stronger men to sit down at the table, and weaker men to step aside. Yet, as he sat beside the woman, resting one hand upon her belly in that rain-soaked market, all of it suddenly seemed strangely small. For the first time, an entirely different desire began to kindle inside his chest. It wasn't the desire to make someone afraid. It was the desire to return something to a dead scaffolder, and the woman he'd loved. Something the entire city still owed them both. Justice. Grayson said nothing to Sadie about it. He merely carved the name of that construction company into his memory, as though engraving it into stone. Darkness had begun to fall when the familiar faint squeak of wheels sounded across the pavement behind them. The elderly flower seller approached in her faded woolen cardigan, a brown paper parcel tied with twine resting on her lap, and Sadie's face lit up as she hurried toward her like someone welcoming a beloved relative home. "Rosa, where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you. Do your arms and legs still hurt?" "They're better now. Much better. Thanks to someone who knelt down and helped this old woman up that day." The elderly woman smiled with toothless warmth and patted the brown paper parcel. "I've been sitting idle for weeks, so I knitted a few things for that baby in your belly. There's a hat, some mittens, and even a pair of socks, no bigger than my fingers. But there's too much for me to carry here. Come by my house this weekend and collect the rest. I don't live far away. I'll write down the address for you." Sadie clasped the elderly woman's wrinkled hand, so deeply touched that she didn't notice the man on the steps behind her, turning his face away to conceal a brief flicker of embarrassment. Nor did she notice the way Rosa's eyes swept over him, swift as a bird in flight, carrying something remarkably like the satisfaction of a woman who'd just placed the final piece upon the board. On a weekend morning, Sadie put on the neatest sweater she owned, bought a small bag of oranges as a gift for the old woman, then took 2 buses, following the address that had been carefully written on a scrap of paper. The second bus carried her away from the streets she knew, traveling along the lakeside road on the northern edge of the city, where the low fences gradually thinned and gave way to towering stone walls. When she stepped off at the final stop, walked another stretch, and checked the paper for the 3rd time, she found herself standing before a massive black iron gate whose curling design resembled the wings of 2 eagles. Beyond it, a white gravel drive led toward a gray stone mansion of the kind she'd always believed existed only in movies. She stood rooted to the spot, certain she'd come to the wrong place, until the gate opened automatically, and the middle-aged guard inside gave a slight bow. "Miss Brooks, please come in. The lady of the house is expecting you." The lady of the house. Those words followed Sadie along the long gravel drive like a riddle, and the answer was waiting in the center of the grand foyer, where the elderly flower seller from Red Brick Market sat in a wheelchair upholstered in gleaming black leather. She wasn't wearing her faded cardigan or her torn gloves, but an elegant ash-gray shawl. Her silver hair had been combed neatly into place, and behind her, descending the stone staircase, was the man who'd carried sacks of potatoes for Sadie at the market, the man she called Mr. Business, now standing in a black suit beneath a gallery of ancestral portraits, as a passing servant bowed and addressed him as Mr. Vale. Vale. Sadie hadn't spent all those years at the bottom of this city without learning that name. It was a name people mentioned only after lowering their voices, a name attached to doors that even the police knocked upon very softly. The bag of oranges in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "Sadie," Rosa spoke first, her voice still as warm as it had been at the market. "Come in, child. Don't stand there. Let me explain." "Explain." Sadie repeated the word very slowly, and both Rosa and Grayson immediately realized that something wasn't unfolding according to the scene they'd expected. because there was no wonder on the young woman's face at the sight of marble and chandeliers, no sparkle in her eyes like someone who'd suddenly discovered she'd wandered into a fairy tale. There was only something rising very quickly behind her brown eyes, something all the money and power in that house couldn't buy, the anger of someone who'd just understood the truth. So you aren't poor. The old wheelchair, the torn gloves, the bucket of flowers no one wanted. All of it was an act. And you? She turned toward Grayson. Your car wasn't broken down. You weren't passing by because it was convenient. And none of those chance afternoons at the market happened by chance. You knew who I was before you ever spoke to me. Sadie, just let me explain. Answer one question, yes or no. Grayson was silent for a second, then nodded. Yes. All right. Her voice didn't break the way they'd expected. It dropped lower, and that was what made the foyer turn cold. You watched me, arranged scenes around me, waited to see whether I'd choose the right card, whether I was kind enough by your standards, and only then decided whether I deserved to walk through those iron gates. You tested me at the market. Then your son tested me again because he didn't trust his own mother's conclusion. I wasn't a human being in your eyes. I was an examination. Child, I didn't do it to humiliate you. I know, Sadie said, her eyes reddening even as her back remained straight. I know you didn't mean to hurt me. Maybe you even truly care about me, and that's what makes it hurt so much. Look at the way I live. My landlord tested me to see whether I'd cheat him out of the security deposit. The restaurant owner tested whether this belly would bother the customers before he dared hire me to wait tables. This entire city has tested me every day, from the moment I became an orphan until the moment I became a widow. Life has tested me enough. I don't need anyone else grading my kindness, not even someone sitting in a wheelchair plated with gold. She placed the bag of oranges on the stone table beside the door, gently and decisively, like setting down a final period. I brought these for the poor flower seller at the market. I'm sure the lady of the Vale House doesn't need them. Rosa looked at the young woman for a long while. Then, without offering another word in her defense, she quietly lifted a brown paper parcel tied with twine from her lap and opened it. Inside lay a pale blue woolen hat, a pair of tiny mittens, and 2 socks, no larger than an adult's fingers, every stitch slightly uneven from hands that had trembled while making them. Then what about these? She asked softly. I truly knitted them. I knitted them at the market while I waited for people to buy my flowers. You sat beside me for 2 afternoons and never noticed. Everything in this house might have been arranged, but no one could have knitted these stitches for me. Sadie stared at the tiny socks resting on the brown paper, and all the strength she'd forced herself to hold since walking through the gates suddenly wavered. She remembered those afternoons. She remembered the old woman knitting while telling stories of winters long ago, the needles trembling as they slipped up and down, and how Sadie had teased her that at this pace she might as well learn to knit and finish them herself. She reached out and took only the socks, nothing else, then wrapped the remaining items and placed them back in Rosa's hands. I'll accept these, because they were paid for with time, not money. Then she bowed her head once, turned away, and walked back down the white gravel drive and through the black iron gates without looking back even once, leaving the Vale mother and son standing in silence within that vast foyer, looking at each other. For the first time in the history of their family, someone with nothing to her name had turned her back on everything they possessed and walked away carrying nothing but a pair of woolen socks, smaller than the palm of her hand. For the entire week that followed, Grayson sent no flowers, no gifts, and had no one leave anything outside Sadie's door that could be measured in money, because he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, something power had never been able to teach him, that to this woman, every gift right now would only be another lingering insult. Instead, late one afternoon, he appeared at the little laundromat beneath Sadie's boarding house, where the owner, a woman of 60 with salt and pepper hair named Ruthie, was folding clothes behind the counter. Ruthie treated Sadie like a daughter, and was famous along the entire block for never having been afraid of anyone. She looked at the man in the black suit standing among racks of clothing steaming with heat, let her gaze travel from his polished shoes to his face, then gave a dismissive grunt. I know who you are. The girl told me everything. Sit down. That chair is plastic, not cowhide like the ones in your house, so if you break it, you're buying me a new one. Grayson lowered himself onto the short red plastic chair in the middle of the laundromat, his knees nearly touching his chin, and the man who'd once made the entire harbor hold its breath sat perfectly still beneath the interrogating stare of a laundromat owner. I hear you're one of the richest men in this city. I hear people look over their shoulders before they even say your name. So I'm going to ask you one question, and you're going to answer honestly. Give me the wrong answer, and you can get out. She dropped the stack of towels heavily onto the counter. Take away all your money. Take away the Vale name. Take away those black cars and all those men bowing their heads behind you. Strip all of that away until you're nothing but a man. What do you have left that makes you worthy of that girl? Tell me. Steam from the dryers billowed upward, turning the air between them hazy and white, and Grayson remained silent for so long that Ruthie thought he might rise and leave. Then he answered, slowly and clearly, giving weight to every word. What remains is a man who was wrong, and knows he was wrong. I had her investigated. I manufactured excuses to get close to her because I was betrayed once, and afterward, I no longer knew how to trust anyone in an ordinary way. I didn't come here to defend what I did. It was wrong. It was wrong from the very beginning, and she has every right to be angry. I came because I don't want that mistake to be the last thing she ever knows about me. Ruthie narrowed her eyes and studied him for a long while. Then she exhaled sharply, turned her head, and called toward the floor above. Sadie, come down here. Someone's come to repay a debt. Sadie descended the wooden staircase and stopped short when she saw him. She was about to turn around when Ruthie stopped her with a single sentence. Hear him out. If you still want him gone afterward, I'll throw him out myself. Grayson rose from the plastic chair but didn't move any closer. He merely placed a thin set of documents on the counter. I didn't bring a gift. This is a contract. Read it carefully before you say anything. For the bakery you've dreamed about, there's an old storefront at the end of Willow Street that recently closed. The ovens are still in good condition. I'll provide the capital and put my name on the loan, but the bakery will belong to you. The ownership papers will bear the name Sadie Brooks. You'll run it, you'll make every decision, and you'll repay my investment each month from the profits, with a proper interest rate matching the bank's rate, and without a single preferential term. This isn't a gift. It isn't charity. And it certainly isn't a way for me to purchase forgiveness. This is a business arrangement, and I believe it'll be profitable because I tasted the cookies you baked for the vegetable stall owner the other day. Sadie stood motionless for a long time, her eyes moving across every line of the contract as she searched for the trap life had taught her to look for in every document bearing a signature. But she found none. She raised her head. If I accept, I have one condition, and I want it written directly into the contract. Tell me. Every evening, none of the unsold bread or pastries may be thrown away. They must be taken to the shelter on Elm Street before the late meal is served. The cost will come out of my share of the profits, not yours. She looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time since that day at the mansion, her voice softened. Because I was once one of the children standing in that line. I grew up beneath roofs that didn't belong to me, and I remember how warm the smell of bread could feel when someone handed it to you in the cold. My child will be born into a different life, but the children standing in that line are still going to need a loaf of bread that still smells fresh. Grayson looked at the woman standing in the middle of that worn little laundromat, and he knew as clearly as he knew his own name that if this provision wasn't included, the contract wouldn't be worth signing. Make it the first clause, he said. Behind the counter, Ruthie quietly wiped her hands on her apron and turned her face toward the racks of clothing, and no one saw the woman who'd never feared anyone on that block blink several times in rapid succession. The old bakery at the end of Willow Street changed hands so quickly that the neighbors hadn't even finished gossiping before the new sign was already hanging above the door, the words "First Loaf" painted in honey gold against dark brown wood. And if anyone wondered how the permits, repairs, electricity, plumbing, and everything else that would ordinarily consume an entire season of an ordinary person's life had been completed in only a few days, the answer lay in several very brief telephone calls made by a man in a black suit, because in this city, the Vale name opened doors that money alone couldn't always unlock. But inside that little bakery, the name held no power at all. On the first morning, they lit the ovens. Sadie tied a white apron around Grayson's waist, pushed him in front of a large mound of dough, and the man who'd once signed contracts that changed ownership of an entire harbor district now stood awkwardly with both hands covered in flour. After kneading for a while, he managed to flatten the dough into something so pitifully misshapen that it looked as though a car had driven over it, and Sadie leaned against the counter laughing until tears streamed down her cheeks. You're strangling it, not kneading it. Be gentle. Dough is like people. If you keep forcing it, it turns hard. If you're patient with it, it rises. Grayson looked down at his hands, the hands this entire city feared, now utterly helpless before a lump of flour and water, then looked at the pregnant woman carefully bending each of his fingers into the proper position, and he said something that brought her laughter to a sudden stop. This is the first time anyone has ever taught these hands to create something instead of destroying something. From that day forward, the ovens burned warmly, and the scent of fresh bread drifted all the way into the street every morning, just as Sadie had dreamed. Regular customers began recognizing the little pregnant owner and the tall, quiet employee who carried the flour sacks, and each evening, the two of them personally delivered boxes of whatever bread remained to the shelter on Elm Street before the late meal was served. Rosa occasionally stopped by and sat at the wooden table in the corner. She never said very much. She merely watched her two children through the curling steam rising from her tea. One night, after the final batch had come out of the oven and nearly all the lights along Willow Street had gone dark, Sadie and Grayson sat together on the bakery's back steps, and for the first time, he told her about the night that had divided his life into two halves. He told her about the father who'd taught him never to let his face appear in the newspapers, about the burst of gunfire on that rain-drenched night that had taken his father and left his mother in a wheelchair, and about how he'd once believed that if he became cold enough, frightening enough, and incapable of needing anyone, he'd never again have to stand helplessly and watch someone he loved fall. "Have you realized where you were wrong yet?" Sadie asked softly. "I built the walls so high that even I couldn't find a way out." He looked toward the distant glow of the last streetlight. "Until someone knelt in a puddle in front of my mother, and a crack opened in that wall that I couldn't seal. No matter how hard I tried." Sadie said nothing. She pulled the two sides of her coat more closely around her belly, and they remained there for a long time, wrapped in the warmth flowing from the ovens behind them. That night, after Grayson walked her all the way to the door of her rented room, he stopped beneath the dim yellow hallway light. The man who hadn't asked anyone's permission for anything throughout all the years he'd held power suddenly stood there as awkwardly as a schoolboy. "Sadie, I want to kiss you. I'm saying that I want to. I'm not saying that I'm going to, because you haven't given me permission." She looked at him, at the man who could take almost anything he wanted in this city, now standing outside her shabby rented room and waiting for a nod. And she laughed softly, the sound dissolving into the empty hallway. "Mr. Vale, you truly don't know anything, do you? People aren't supposed to ask that question with words." Then she rose onto her toes, and their first kiss took place beneath the flickering hallway light, tender and uncertain, carrying the faint taste of flour still clinging to their clothes. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to make the hardest man in Chicago close his eyes, as though he were afraid the moment might slip away. The days that followed passed like a season neither of them had ever been allowed to live. The bakery grew busier. Sadie's belly grew rounder. Ruthie began referring to Grayson as the girl's flour-hauling employee, though half the sharpness had disappeared from her voice. And on mornings when Sadie stood behind the counter watching him bow his head while an elderly woman complained that the bread was slightly bland that day, then nod solemnly and offer a deeply serious apology, she found herself thinking that perhaps, only perhaps, life had finally decided it owed her a spring. But in this city, happiness was never left undisturbed for long. One gray afternoon, across the street from First Loaf, a silver car remained parked and motionless for hours. One window lowered a quarter of the way. From the darkness inside, a long camera lens silently pointed toward the bakery's warm golden window, where the pregnant owner was laughing with the tall man in the white apron. The camera captured one image after another, patiently and methodically, like a hunter counting his bullets before hunting season began. From that rainy afternoon at the market when Sadie told him about the scaffolder, Grayson had never forgotten the name of the construction company he'd carved into his memory, and throughout the weeks when the bakery ovens burned brightly, another investigation had been burning quietly alongside them, without her knowing anything about it. The finest lawyers in the Vale family had been ordered to reopen every part of the case from that year, silently and meticulously, leaving no report unread, because he wanted to give her something no amount of money could buy: the gift of justice for the man who died, so that the child inside her could one day grow up knowing that its father hadn't been at fault. That night, after walking Sadie home, Grayson remained alone in the little room behind the bakery, where he'd temporarily placed a desk so he could carry flour sacks and sign documents without leaving the shop. He opened the thick file the head of his legal team had just delivered, accompanied by an unusual message. "Sir, you should read this alone." The first page looked ordinary. The second page looked ordinary, but when he reached the stack of subcontracting records, Grayson's hand stopped in midair. The primary contractor on the project that year, the company that had approved the removal of nearly half the safety measures to reduce costs, was a subsidiary of the Sterling Group, a hotel empire that had been drowning in debt for years and had accepted illicit funds from Cormac Doyle, laundering them through construction projects. In return, Doyle was allowed to place his own subcontractors on those projects, and the name of the subcontractor directly responsible for the scaffolding, printed plainly on the records, made the blood in Grayson's veins turn cold. Vale Holdings. It was a shell company Doyle had created long ago, imitating the surname of his most bitter enemy so that if the dirty money was ever traced, every finger would point toward the Vale family. Grayson sat motionless before those papers for a very long time, listening as rain began tapping against the metal roof behind the bakery, and for the first time in many years, his hands felt cold. The man Sadie had loved, the injustice of his death, had somehow become bound to the very two names now closing in around Grayson's life, the Vale family's lifelong enemy, and the family of the woman he'd just cast out of his life. Worst of all, it was bound to a company bearing the same name engraved above the gates of his home. He had to tell Sadie. He had to tell her himself before she heard it from anyone else. But how could he say it? Where could he possibly begin? He needed one night to think, and fate refused to give him even that. There was a soft knock at the back door, followed by the sound of a key turning in the lock. Sadie stepped inside carrying a paper box, tiny drops of rain clinging to her hair. She'd returned because she'd forgotten the pastries she'd set aside for Ruthie, and when she saw the light still burning in the back room, she stopped in. She was halfway through teasing him that if the flower hauler stayed up this late, then tomorrow he would, when her eyes fell upon the desk, upon the open file, upon the photograph of the construction site tucked into the corner of a page, upon the name Caleb Hayes printed in bold letters across the first line of the report, and then upon the two words she could never have failed to recognize, no matter how small the print might have been: Vale Holdings. The paper box didn't fall from her hands. She placed it on the edge of the desk, very slowly and perfectly straight, and that calm was more frightening than any scream could have been. "Sadie, listen to me." Grayson shot to his feet. "This file isn't what you think it is. Let me explain everything from the beginning. Caleb's name," she said, her voice turning as pale and empty as the paper beneath the light, "is lying on your desk, beside your family's name. That company doesn't belong to me. It's a false company, someone created to frame my family. I only learned about it tonight. I reopened the investigation because of you, because I wanted to get justice for him. You investigated it," she repeated the words, and something inside her eyes began breaking apart in great pieces. "You knew the company's name from that afternoon when I told you at the market. All this time, you've held everything about the death of my child's father in your hands. Every day, you lit the ovens with me, delivered bread with me, and never said a word. Once again, when I'm beside you, I never know what's real and what's being arranged behind my back, do I? Sadie." "Don't." She stepped back when he moved toward her, only one step, but the distance it created was longer than the entire white gravel drive at the Vale mansion. She looked at him one last time. Her eyes no longer held the anger they'd carried when she'd stood in the grand foyer. There was only a weariness so deep it seemed to reach the very bottom of her soul. The weariness of someone who dared to trust one more time, and found herself once again standing amid documents she couldn't understand. Then she turned and walked out into the rain, which was falling harder now, without an umbrella or a hat, one hand resting protectively above her belly. The bakery's back door closed behind her with a click so faint it could scarcely be heard. Yet in that room, where one man stood alone among pages of evidence scattered beneath the light, that quiet sound echoed louder than any slamming door he'd ever heard in his life. For 3 straight days, Sadie didn't go to the bakery. She told Ruthie she wasn't feeling well, hung a temporarily closed sign on the glass door of First Loaf, and Grayson didn't call, didn't send a message, and didn't wait beneath her window the way men always did in the movies she'd once watched. Because he understood that there were some fractures words would only split wider, and that woman had already heard more than enough carefully arranged words in her lifetime. On the morning of the 4th day, when Sadie opened the door of her rented room, intending to go downstairs and help Ruthie at the laundromat so she could take her mind off things, her foot touched a heavy cardboard box placed neatly on the threshold. There was no ribbon, no elaborate card, only a single handwritten line in black ink across the top. the letters as straight and restrained as the man who'd written them. "You don't have to believe me, but those 12 families need the truth as much as you do." She carried the box inside, sat on the edge of her bed, and opened it. Inside was the complete original file from the case all those years ago, arranged in chronological order. Every report, every subcontracting record, every page of expert findings she hadn't been able to afford to request copies of back then. Everything that company had once concealed behind closed meetings now lay perfectly flat beneath the light of her rented room, accompanied by a legal analysis identifying who had signed off on the cuts to the safety provisions, which accounts the illicit money had passed through, and whose hands had created the company called Vale Holdings, where it had been registered, whose surname it had imitated, and for what purpose. She read every page slowly, missing nothing, the way she'd read every document bearing a signature since the day life had taught her that she must. And the further she read, the more violently her hands trembled. At the very bottom of the box lay a thinner stack of papers, the red court seal still fresh. The lawsuit had officially been accepted. The plaintiffs weren't Grayson Vale or any company belonging to the Vale family, but 12 families of workers who had suffered because of that contractor's projects over the years, 12 names the legal team had quietly traced from house to house, from boarding house to boarding house, and to small towns beyond state lines, inviting each family to stand and be heard. Every legal expense had already been paid, and the person responsible had requested anonymity. Sadie turned to the list of compensation claims, and there, on the first line, printed in bold above all the others, was the name Caleb Hayes. She sat for a very long time with that page resting on her lap, her thumb gently brushing across each letter of his name as though she were touching a face, and the first tear fell upon that exact place, spreading into a small circle across the white paper. Then came the second tear, and the third. She didn't wipe them away. She simply let them fall. The woman who hadn't cried in front of anyone since the day she'd stood at that construction site now sat alone in her cramped, rented room, clutching the file against her chest and weeping as though every winter she'd endured had gathered together and poured out on that one morning. At that same hour, on the other side of the city, another set of papers had just been placed on a desk in the penthouse office of the Sterling building. A court summons naming the corporation as a defendant. Bianca Sterling stood frozen beside the window as she listened to her father raging in the conference room about the lawsuit that had appeared from nowhere and might finally bring down whatever remained of a family already drowning in debt. She picked up her phone and opened the collection of photographs the silver car had sent several days earlier, scrolling through image after image taken through the warmly lit window of a bakery on Willow Street. Then her finger stopped. She pinched the screen, spread her fingers, and enlarged the face of the pregnant woman smiling behind the counter, the same face she'd seen once before in the rain-soaked market. In that deathly silent room, with only the low hum of the air conditioner, Bianca Sterling didn't say a word. She didn't smash anything or scream. She merely stared at the photograph for a very long time with eyes that seemed to have no bottom, then saved it inside a separate folder she had just created and hadn't yet named. The phone screen went dark, surrendering the room once more to the shadow of a woman standing motionless amid the slanting bands of sunlight cutting across the stone floor. Sadie returned to the bakery the following morning and said nothing about the cardboard box. She simply placed a still warm loaf of bread on the work table in the back room, along with a small note bearing only the words, "Thank you on behalf of 12 families." When Grayson walked in and saw that loaf, he understood that the door between them had opened a crack again. It hadn't swung wide, but it had opened, and for a man like him, that was enough to wait with patience. But in this city, whenever happiness had only just begun to mend itself, the storm always arrived first. It began with an article published that evening on Chicago's most widely read tabloid website, accompanied by a collection of photographs taken through the window of First Loaf. The headline was so sensational that Ruthie had to remove her glasses and wipe them twice after reading it. The mystery pregnant woman who ensnared the city's most reclusive heir. The article didn't include a single full name, yet it contained every insinuation it needed. It suggested that the woman had appeared from nowhere, questioned where the money had come from to open the bakery so quickly, and declared that penniless women who approached wealthy men had always wanted only one thing. It even implied that the baby might have been a carefully calculated move to gain entry into a powerful and wealthy family. Every sentence had been sharpened so carefully that no one could sue, yet anyone who read it understood exactly what it meant. By the following morning, 2 strangers carrying cameras were lingering across Willow Street. Soon there were 4. They photographed everything. They photographed Sadie opening the bakery, photographed her carrying trays of bread, and even photographed an elderly regular walking inside to buy a loaf of cinnamon bread, only for the poor woman to find her own picture online the next day, beneath a mocking caption. Customers began staying away. They didn't hate Sadie. They were merely afraid of the cameras and the gossip, and that deeply human uneasiness caused the bell above the bakery door to ring less often, with each passing day. On some afternoons, the entire shop sold only a handful of loaves, while trays of bread slowly cooled behind the counter like a row of questions no one was willing to answer. Sadie didn't publish a response. She didn't hire anyone to write an article defending her, and she didn't offer the story of her suffering to any newspaper, even when some outlets offered to pay for an interview. She did only one thing. She opened the doors on time, lit the ovens on time, baked every batch on schedule, and each evening, she still carried the remaining boxes of bread to the shelter on Elm Street with her own hands, just as the first clause of the contract required. Life had taught her the same lesson over and over again. She couldn't silence the tongues of strangers. She could only live in such a way that one day, those tongues would become ashamed of themselves. Grayson was the one who couldn't bear it. On the third night of the storm, he stood in the bakery's back room with his phone in his hand, his voice returning to the low, steady tone he'd used in warehouse number 7. It would take only one call. That website would remove the article before midnight, and its editor would learn several things about earning a living with decency. One more call, and the 4 men standing across the street would never return to this neighborhood. But Sadie placed her hand over his phone, pressed it down against the table, and shook her head. "I know you can do it. That's exactly what frightens me." She looked directly into his eyes, calm but unwavering. "They're saying I came to you because of the power standing behind you. If you use the darkness to protect me now, then I'll become exactly what they say I am. Don't you understand? I don't need to be protected that way. I need you to stand beside me in the daylight." Grayson stared for a long time at the small woman who had stopped the hand of the man who ruled the entire harbor district with nothing more than a single sentence. Then he slipped the phone into the inside pocket of his coat, and the following morning, everyone on Willow Street witnessed something they had never seen before. In the middle of the morning, while the tabloid reporters were still leaning sleepily against the lampposts, a tall man in a gray wool coat walked over and took his place at the end of the short line outside First Loaf. He waited for his turn like every other customer, bought 2 loaves of bread, and paid properly. When every camera swung toward him, he turned around, stood straight in the middle of the sidewalk, and spoke each word clearly, without anyone having written it for him. "My name is Grayson. I'm the man pursuing the owner of this bakery. And to do that, I've had to learn how to knead dough, how to apologize, and how to wait in line. She has never once asked how much money I have, but she did make me put a clause in our contract requiring that bread be donated to the shelter every evening. You may write that exactly as I've said it. If you choose to write something false, then your own conscience can read it back to you." The small crowd outside the bakery fell silent for a moment, and then someone began to applaud. The homeless old man who had once pushed a cart filled with empty cans forced his way in front of the cameras, waving his hands as he told them that Sadie had broken her own loaf in half to feed him long before she'd had a bakery of her own. Ruthie abandoned the laundromat counter and marched across the street with her hands planted on her hips, daring anyone to print another lie about the girl she called her daughter. Then came the elderly woman who bought cinnamon bread, followed by the vegetable seller from the old market. One by one, people stepped forward like scattered bricks, finding their way home to rebuild a wall. In the middle of it all, the most aggressive reporter in the group pushed through the crowd, intending to thrust his camera into Sadie's face while asking a spiteful question about her baby. Grayson merely turned and looked at him. He didn't say a word. He didn't touch him with a single finger. He only looked. Yet that gaze, the same gaze that had once silenced warehouse number 7, made the man holding the camera suddenly feel his throat go dry. His feet carried him 2 steps backward before he slipped away to the far edge of the crowd. Because there are some wolves who may stand in line to buy bread beneath the morning sun, but it takes only one look into their eyes for everyone to remember that they are still wolves. The storm of press attention finally subsided after that morning, when all of Willow Street stood behind the bakery, and customers returned in even greater numbers than before. But those relentless weeks had taken more out of Sadie than she realized. Then, one night when the wind shifted and the weather turned cold, just after the 2 of them had closed the bakery following a bread delivery to the shelter, She suddenly stopped in the middle of the kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, and the other resting over her belly. Her face briefly turned pale, and she whispered, "Grayson, I think our little girl wants to come earlier than expected." Grayson carried her to the car in both arms, and the black vehicle raced through the rain-slicked streets toward the hospital faster than any car he'd ever ridden in. The rest of that night belonged to the white corridors outside the maternity ward. The doctors hurried Sadie inside with swift footsteps but reassuring voices, while Grayson was stopped behind a frosted glass door. And so, the man whose name made all of Chicago lower its voice sat down on a blue plastic chair in the hallway, flowers still clinging to his wool coat, his hands clasped together and trembling. He'd stood inside warehouse number 7 without blinking. He'd sat behind the glass of a prison visiting room through all those months of wrongful confinement without shedding a single tear. Yet tonight, before one hospital door, his hands refused to obey him. He bowed his head, pressed his forehead against his clenched fists, and for the first time since his father's funeral, Grayson Vale prayed. It was awkward and disordered, without any proper words or form. He simply repeated one plea over and over inside his heart. "Please let Sadie and her baby be safe. Take anything from me in return." The faint squeak of wheels drifted across the tiled floor. Merrick had brought Rosa there at some point, and she rolled her wheelchair beside her son. For a long while, she said nothing. She merely placed her wrinkled hand over his trembling fists. "I've been watching you," she said softly. "Do you know that your father could hold anything in his hands without wavering? In all the years I knew him, I never once saw those hands tremble except for one night, the night I gave birth to you. He sat in a hallway just like this one, and he trembled exactly as you're trembling now. Grayson, the greatest power I've ever witnessed in my life wasn't found in a gun. It was found in having the courage to love, while knowing you might lose what you love. Tonight, you've finally become stronger than your father ever was." He didn't answer. He only tightened his hold on his mother's hand, and the two of them remained that way until the glass door opened, and the doctor on duty approached with the smile of someone carrying good news. Everything had stabilized. The baby was simply a little impatient, but she wasn't ready to come out just yet. Her heartbeat was steady and strong. Her mother would need complete rest for several days, and family members could visit one at a time. Grayson stood outside the hospital room and looked through the small glass window. Sadie was sleeping lightly, the color having returned to her face beneath the gentle light. A small machine beside the bed sounded a steady rhythm, peaceful as the measured beat of a song whose words hadn't yet been written. He placed one hand against the glass, leaned closer, and spoke so quietly that it seemed meant for only one person inside that room, the one who hadn't yet been born. "Hello, little one. I'm the man who carries flour for your mother. I'm not your father. Your father was a much better man than I am, and I'm fighting to reclaim justice for him, so you don't need to worry about that. But if you'll allow me, then beginning tonight, I'd like to be the first man in your life who will never abandon you. Just stay healthy and come out when you're ready. Your mother is waiting out here, and so are your grandmother, Aunt Ruthie, and me." The following morning, when Sadie awoke, the first thing she saw was the man who had fallen asleep with his head bowed on the chair beside her bed, one hand still loosely holding the edge of her blanket, the streak of flour from the previous night still marking his coat. When he startled awake and found her watching him, he offered no elaborate declaration. He simply lowered himself onto one knee on the hospital room floor and opened his palm. Resting there was an old ring worn smooth by time, the ring his father had given his mother when they'd had nothing to their names. "I planned to wait for a beautiful restaurant and an elegant evening. But last night, I realized I don't need beauty or elegance. I only need you to still be here. Sadie Brooks, will you allow this flower carrier to stand beside you and your daughter for the rest of my life?" And in that hospital room filled with early morning sunlight, a woman could be heard laughing through her tears. Her answer never formed into any clearly spoken words, but the hand she held out to him was clearer than any answer in the world. News of the engagement in the Vale family never appeared in the newspapers, and no invitations were sent beyond the inner circle. It passed only through a very narrow group, made up of those the organization referred to simply as the Elders. Old friends of Grayson's father from the days before the Harbor District had even been divided by boundaries. Yet less than a week later, the news still found its way to the penthouse office of the Sterling building, where a woman who had lost nearly everything sat and listened until the messenger had finished speaking. She didn't smash a single object. She merely reopened the unnamed photograph folder on her phone. looked once more at the face behind the bakery window, then picked up the phone and called the man who specialized in work that had no name. The target they found wasn't difficult to reach. First Loaf employed a college student named Wade, 22 years old, who delivered bread in the mornings, then washed trays and swept the shop in the afternoons. He was a gentle young man whom Sadie had hired because she felt compassion for the way he struggled through life alone, and he owed so much for his final semester that the school had already sent a notice warning that he would be removed from enrollment unless the balance was paid before the end of the month. Every night, in a rented room scarcely larger than a matchbox, he opened that notice, read it again, and closed it. They approached him at a cheap diner near the college. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat sat down across from him and pushed a thick envelope and a small velvet box across the table. Inside the box lay an antique emerald bracelet, something she had spent the last of the money in her private safe to buy back from a dealer in old valuables who specialized in hunting down possessions once owned by powerful families. It was the Vale family heirloom that had gone missing a generation earlier, and everyone in the collecting world knew its history. The offer came in a voice as sweet as pouring honey. He only had to do one small thing. On the day of the engagement ceremony, his employer would surely bring the cloth bag of baby things she carried everywhere like a good luck charm. He was close to her. All he had to do was place the bracelet at the bottom of that bag before the ceremony began. No one would ever ask him another question. And the money in the envelope was enough to pay his final semester's tuition with some left over. An early graduation gift. He could continue his education or throw away his future. The choice was his. Wade sat before the two objects for a very long time, his fingers tightening around the rim of a glass filled with water that had already gone warm. At last, in a moment he would later have traded many things to take back, he nodded. But there was one thing neither the woman in the wide-brimmed hat nor the college student knew. That cheap diner stood in a neighborhood where the eyes of the Vale family never slept, and a middle-aged man sitting at a shadowed corner table behind an old newspaper had allowed the phone in his breast pocket to do its work from the first, second, to the last. Ever since the tabloid article appeared, Merrick had quietly assigned men to follow every unfamiliar face, lingering near the bakery or around anyone who worked there, the instinct of an old fox who had survived 2 generations of masters. That same evening, the recording was placed on Grayson's desk at the mansion. When that honey-sweet voice reached the part about the cloth bag of baby things, the master of the Vale family surged to his feet, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out. The cold radiating from him forced even Merrick to retreat half a step. "She dared to target the baby's bag," he said, his voice dropping into the tone of warehouse number 7. "I want her sitting in front of me tonight. I want the man who accepted her money removed from the bakery before dawn. This ends before it has the chance to begin." Then came the faint squeak of wheels at the threshold. Rosa had been sitting there for some time and had heard everything. She spoke only one sentence. "Wait, my son." She rolled her wheelchair into the middle of the room and motioned for Merrick to play the recording again. With her eyes half closed, she listened from beginning to end like someone hearing an old piece of music. Then she opened them, and deep within those aged eyes gleamed the same light Grayson had seen only twice in his life. Once before the introductory dinner, and once before the gates of Red Brick Market. "If you stop her tonight, she'll deny everything. That envelope will become a loan. The bracelet will become something she has never seen. Then, before long, she'll crawl out of another hole carrying a different knife. Do you intend to spend the rest of your life guarding the door for your wife and child? No. If you want to pull out a poisonous weed, you must let it push every last root above the soil. The engagement ceremony will take place on the appointed day and at the appointed hour. Not one detail will change. Wade will go to work as usual, and no one will alert him. Leave the rest to me." She turned toward the old bodyguard and delivered each instruction in the voice of someone who had already arranged every piece on the board before her opponent had even taken a seat. When she reached the final order, Merrick lowered his head in acknowledgement. "Yes, ma'am. And as for the outer security perimeter that day, the east gate will be careless exactly as you instructed, wide enough for one person to slip through." Grayson looked at his mother, then at the old bodyguard, and slowly lowered himself back into the chair behind his desk, because he had finally understood the game the woman in the wheelchair was preparing to play. It was a net woven from the prey's own greed and hatred, and the only thing the Vale family needed to do now was leave one gate slightly open, then stand still and wait for the poisonous wind to blow itself inside. On the day of the engagement celebration, The great hall of the Vale mansion glowed warmly beneath the candlelight. There was no extravagant display, only rows of wooden tables covered in white cloth, white daisies arranged in simple ceramic vases according to Sadie's wishes, and silver-haired guests, who might not have returned the gesture even if all of Chicago bowed before them. The elders of the organization and old friends of Grayson's father sat together in the rows of honor. On the other side sat Ruthie in the finest dress she'd ever owned, the homeless old man walking awkwardly in a brand-new suit someone had given him, several women who owned stalls at Red Brick Market, and an entire poor neighborhood invited to sit as equals beside the underworld. Between those two worlds stood Sadie in a soft cream-colored dress, with the familiar cloth bag of baby things resting neatly on the chair beside her, just as it did everywhere she went. The ceremony had only just passed the exchange of rings, and the sound of glasses touching hadn't yet faded when the doors to the hall burst open. Bianca Sterling entered dressed in black as though she were attending a trial. She strode directly past the rows of stunned guests, stopped in the center of the hall, and raised her voice, sharp and high. "Forgive me for ruining the celebration, but all of you deserve to know whose union you're blessing. Your bride is a thief. The Vale family's own heirloom emerald bracelet, the lost treasure the late Mr. Vale spent half his life searching for, is inside her bag of baby things. If you don't believe me, open it and see for yourselves. I have my own source." The entire hall fell silent. The elders frowned and exchanged glances while Sadie stood frozen, unable to understand what was happening. Bianca didn't wait for permission. She rushed to the chair under the eyes of every guest, seized the cloth bag, pulled open the zipper, turned it upside down, and shook everything onto the floor. Tiny baby clothes tumbled out. A pale blue knitted cap fell after them, followed by a pair of little mittens, and then nothing more. The empty bag hung open beneath the candlelight, exposing its white cloth bottom. There were no emeralds, no gold, nothing but the fresh scent of newly washed baby clothes. Bianca turned the bag over again and again, then tore apart its lining. Her hands began to tremble, and triumph drained from her face until it was deathly pale. "That's impossible," she muttered. Then she screamed into the hall. "Someone put it in here. I swear it was at the bottom of this bag this morning. Someone placed it right here with their own hands. I know because..." She stopped in the middle of the sentence, but it was already too late. Those unfinished words fell into the silent hall like a complete confession. The elders exchanged another look, and this time, the suspicion in their eyes was no longer directed at the bride. From the row of honor came the faint squeak of wheels rolling across stone. Rosa slowly moved into the center of the hall, and before every guest gathered there, she opened her right hand. Resting against her wrinkled palm was the antique emerald bracelet, gleaming a deep green beneath the candlelight. "Is this what you're looking for?" she asked, her voice so calm that it sent a chill through the room. "I've been keeping this bracelet safe for you since last night. My people removed it from my daughter-in-law's bag before the dew had even fallen. As for how I knew it was there, you may listen with everyone else." She gave a slight nod, and a recording began to play through the speakers of the great hall, every word perfectly clear. A woman's voice, as sweet as honey being poured inside a cheap diner, drifted across the room. "All you have to do is place this bracelet at the bottom of that bag before the ceremony. The money in this envelope will be enough to pay your final semester's tuition." Sentence after sentence came crashing down upon the woman who had spoken them while two different worlds stood listening together. When the recording ended, Wade staggered forward from the back of the hall, his face as white as paper. He collapsed to his knees on the stone floor in the middle of the aisle and raised the still-sealed envelope above his head with both hands. "I'm sorry, Miss Sadie. I was wrong. I haven't spent a single dollar. I slipped the bracelet into your bag last night, but when I saw you smile at me this morning, I felt so ashamed of what I did. I was still too afraid to tell anyone. I'll accept all the blame." Bianca looked around at the silver-haired faces, cold and immovable as boulders. She looked at the envelope, then at the bracelet in the hand of the elderly woman in the wheelchair, and something inside her finally snapped. A broken hiss escaped her throat, and she lunged toward Sadie. She hadn't taken her third step when a dark figure moved. Grayson took exactly one step. He didn't raise a hand or touch Bianca. He simply stood there, placing himself completely between her and the pregnant woman behind him like a wall with a heartbeat. Then he lowered his voice until everyone in the hall had to hold their breath to hear every word. "You humiliated my mother because you believed she was poor. Now you've falsely accused my future wife inside my own home. In the same year, with the same two hands. No one has ever done both of those things in this hall and still been permitted to walk out through the front door. You'll be the first. And I strongly advise you not to make this the last time you're able to walk anywhere on your own. Merrick opened the great doors, allowing the afternoon light to spill across the floor in a long, bright path. Bianca stood within that light for one more heartbeat, then turned and walked out without another scream or word. That silence made Ruthie instinctively tighten her hand around Sadie's, because just before the woman in black disappeared beyond the doors, she looked back at Grayson one final time. Very slowly. There was no madness left in those eyes, and no tears remained. There was only a stillness cold enough to raise the hair on the back of one's neck. The stillness of someone who had just made a decision that no one inside that hall could yet imagine. In the darkened penthouse, Bianca Sterling sat motionless before the sickly blue glow of her phone, her fingers scrolling through one knife wound after another. Somehow, the recording from the cheap diner had reached the investment community and spread through the private circles of the elite. The largest partner fund sent a letter ending negotiations with the Sterling Group in only 3 cold lines. 2 brands that had once made her the face of their campaigns announced that they were terminating their partnerships less than half a day apart. The people who had once competed to seat her in the front row at their parties quietly left their shared group chats without a word of farewell. The last message she received that night came from her own father, and it contained only one sentence. "Don't come back to the company. You've done enough." The screen went dark, and the room sank completely into shadow, leaving only the breathing of a woman who had finally hit bottom. During those same days, something very different was unfolding on Willow Street. Wade had been detained by the Vale family's men after the ceremony, and by every ordinary rule of the world behind iron gates. The fate of someone who had accepted money to harm a member of the Vale family wasn't something anyone wished to contemplate. Wade understood that, as he sat huddled in a small room, waiting for judgment. Yet the person who entered was Sadie, her belly already heavy, carrying a box of waffles that were still warm. She set the box on the table before him as though placing it in front of a younger brother, then turned toward Grayson and Merrick, who stood behind her, and spoke in a voice that allowed no negotiation. "I'm asking you for one thing. Let him go home, and don't pursue this any further." Grayson looked at her. "He nearly made you appear guilty of theft in front of both families," he said. Sadie nodded. "I know, but hear me out." Then she sat across from the college student, whose head remained bowed, and pushed a thin envelope toward him. It wasn't the envelope from the other woman. This one belonged to Sadie. Inside was a receipt, showing that his final semester's tuition had been paid directly to the school that very morning. Wade's head snapped up, his lips trembling. "Miss Sadie, I can't accept this. I'm the one who—" Sadie interrupted him in a perfectly calm voice. "Listen to me. I'm not buying your loyalty. That can't be bought. And you've just taught me that. I'm paying for a lesson both of us need to remember. You need to remember that one moment of weakness can alter an entire life. I need to remember that the person who betrays us sometimes isn't evil. Sometimes that person has simply been driven into a corner, and no one reached out a hand soon enough. I once stood in that corner myself, so today I'm reaching out mine. Finish your final semester and do it well. Become someone useful to the world, and will consider your debt to me repaid." Wade collapsed over the table and wept like a child. Grayson stood silently beside the doorframe, watching the woman he loved, and in that moment, he suddenly understood something that shook him to his core. All his life, he had used fear to keep people from daring to betray him, and they obeyed him only for as long as he remained frightening. This woman had used nothing but a box of waffles and a tuition receipt. Yet that young man would remain loyal to her for the rest of his life. It was a kind of power that couldn't be found in any safe belonging to the Vale family, and he, the ruler of the South Harbor district, was standing there learning it from a bakery owner. But at the bottom of the abyss on the other side of the city, the woman who had fallen didn't think about climbing back up. She thought about dragging someone else down with her. Bianca remained inside the dark penthouse for 2 more days. And on the 3rd night, she picked up the phone and called a number her father had forbidden her ever to touch. The number of the man to whom the Sterling family owed debts that appeared in no ledger, Cormac Doyle. They met inside a restaurant in the North District that had closed early for the night. The red-haired man sat with half his face concealed beneath the shadow of a hanging lamp. When Bianca finished speaking, he gave a dry laugh. "Miss Sterling, you've come to ask me to erase the debts of your sinking family. And what exactly are you offering in return?" I already have everything. Bianca placed her phone on the table and turned the screen toward him. It displayed the court's public information page and the scheduled hearing in the lawsuit filed by 12 workers' families. Because the Sterling family was named as a defendant, Bianca knew every detail. She spoke slowly, each word falling like a pebble into a well. I don't have his security schedule. Everything was changed after we separated. But I do have this. On this date, at the Central Civil Courthouse, Grayson Vale will appear in person to submit additional documents in the case. In person, because he wants to seek justice with his own hands for the father of that woman's child. A man like him enters a public place, perhaps once a year. You know the route from the courthouse to the northern outskirts better than I do. As for the Sterling family's debt, consider this information, my broker's fee. The hanging lamp remained still above a long silence. Then Cormac Doyle leaned forward from the darkness, and his smile made even a woman who had nothing left to lose instinctively slide her chair back half a handspan. He had waited years for the man named Vale to expose a weakness. Ever since the night a challenge had been sent from warehouse number 7. Now the prey was stepping willingly from its den in broad daylight, taking a route that crossed a deserted bridge over a shallow branch of the river, a place where darkness fell quickly and the streetlights stood so far apart that someone could raise an entire wall of steel across the road, and the city wouldn't know about it until half an hour later. The day Grayson returned to court to submit the additional documents, the sky was strangely clear. The proceedings went more smoothly than expected. The judges accepted all the new evidence and set a trial date, and he descended the courthouse steps with the rare sense of relief belonging to a man who had finally laid one decent brick into the foundation of his life. Then he climbed into the car and headed toward the northern outskirts as the sunset began settling over the city. The black car reached the deserted bridge spanning a dry branch of the river just as darkness fell, and everything happened within only a few breaths. A truck stood across the middle of the bridge as though it had broken down. Merrick had only just begun to slow the car when pairs of headlights flared to life at both ends of the bridge and surged forward, sealing off every path of escape. Engines roared on all sides. The windshield in front of Merrick suddenly fractured into a white spiderweb beneath a violent impact. But the old bodyguard still managed to wrench the steering wheel all the way around, turning the car sideways and using its body as a shield to protect the door beside his master before the vehicle shuddered to a halt, leaning heavily to one side. Smoke began creeping from beneath the hood. Grayson kicked open the door, raced around the front of the car, and used both hands to pull the wounded Merrick from the driver's seat. He supported the old man as they retreated into the open space at the center of the bridge, just before flames caught at the front of the vehicle. When Grayson raised his head, Cormac Doyle was standing there amid a circle of his men, wearing the smile he had waited years to show. But the ruler of the North District had failed to account for one thing. That old fox Merrick never took his master anywhere without an invisible layer of armor following close behind. Vale family vehicles appeared at both ends of the bridge only a short while later, and the balance of power reversed as swiftly as the turning of a hand. Doyle's men surrendered their weapons one after another, and in the shifting firelight at the center of the bridge, Doyle himself knelt on the asphalt and looked up into the black barrel of the gun held by Grayson Vale, the man whose father had fallen to bullets, whose mother sat in a wheelchair because of bullets, and who had every reason in the world to tighten his finger around the trigger. The entire bridge seemed to hold its breath. Then Grayson lowered the gun, slowly and decisively. "You want me to pull this trigger, don't you?" he said, his voice low and weary. "You want me to become a monster again so that my daughter will grow up in the same darkness I did? No. You aren't worth what that would cost me. You'll go to prison because of evidence, because of black ink on white paper, like the most ordinary loser imaginable." He threw a copy of the case file onto the ground before Doyle, containing every detail of the money laundering network operating through shell companies that the Vale legal team had uncovered through the lawsuit. All of it had been on the investigators' desks since that afternoon. "You're finished, and the company you created under my family name will be the final nail. It'll drag down every last person who accepted your dirty money." Doyle and all his men were arrested on the bridge that night. In the days that followed, the doors of the law slammed shut one after another around the North District Empire, pulling what remained of the Sterling family into the legal proceedings as well. Meanwhile, in a hospital corridor, an old scene unfolded in reverse. Grayson sat on a blue plastic chair outside Merrick's room, his clothes still carrying the smell of smoke. Sadie arrived without saying anything, sat beside him, took his still trembling hand, and placed it in her own. This time, it's my turn to wait with you, she whispered. They remained that way until the doctor came out to tell them that the old bodyguard was out of danger and was already complaining that he wanted porridge. On the night before she gave birth, Sadie sat propped against the headboard in a small room, warmed by yellow light. She held the old phone with its cracked screen, opened the starred voice message, and for the first time after so many seasons, pressed play and listened to the entire recording. Caleb's voice filled the room, warm and clear as a morning that had never grown old. At the beginning, he laughed and reminded her to eat breakfast, exactly as she remembered. Then came the part she had never dared to hear. There's a lot going on at the construction site today, so I want to say this now before I forget. I've been thinking about it for a long time. If our baby is a girl, let's name her Hope, because you're my hope. I didn't know hope was real until the day I met you. All right, I have to start my shift now. I love both of you. The message ended, and the room fell silent. Sadie sat there for a long time with the phone pressed against her heart, tears falling as a smile trembled at the corners of her lips. Thank you, she whispered into that gentle emptiness. I heard it. I heard every word. Baby Hope entered the world on a morning flooded with sunlight. Her first cry sent laughter bursting through the entire corridor. Grayson was the first person allowed to carry her into the light, pouring through the window and softly speak her name. Hope. Hello from Uncle Grayson. Rosa welcomed her granddaughter into her arms from her wheelchair, her aged eyes gleaming as though she had become 20 years younger. Ruthie wept loudly enough to fill the room, then laughed more joyfully than anyone else. That day, First Loaf hung a small wooden sign on the door that read, "Closed for one day. Our family has welcomed someone new." Not long afterward, people saw the Vale family quietly withdraw from every remaining corner of darkness. The nightclubs changed hands, the questionable business connections were severed, and only legitimate companies remained beneath the open light of day. When people asked why, Grayson gave them only one answer: because my daughter will grow up in the light. On the day Hope turned 1 month old, Rosa held her sleeping granddaughter in the sunlit garden of the mansion and looked at her son standing beside his young wife, near trays of fragrant bread and pastries. Then she spoke to everyone gathered there, yet her words seemed meant for life itself. People often measure a man by what he can destroy, but the true measure of him lies in what he bends down to lift. And a mother isn't measured by the ring on her hand, but by the pool of cold water she's willing to kneel in for a stranger. The story of Sadie and Grayson ended there, amid the scent of bread and the laughter of children, leaving us with something simple yet immense. Kindness is never weakness. It's the only strength capable of opening doors before which money and power must remain outside. Family isn't the place where we were born, but the place where someone is willing to kneel in the mud for us. And when we plant a seed of kindness in this life, we can never know where it may one day bloom into spring. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day, because stories of kindness deserve to continue being told. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? Which moment moved you most deeply? Please share the feelings from the depths of your heart in the comments. We're always grateful to read every line you choose to share. Thank you for staying with us until the final moment of this story. May you and your family always enjoy good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and serenity. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.